And it's also really interesting. I would say the other aspect of South Park Commons is that when people go on to great things, they're often surrounded by other people who are kind of like very talented, who are all kind of like in this awesome, like slightly competitive, slightly collaborative setting. You know, like if you think about academia, you think about sports teams, there are these really talented people who are all kind of pushing each other to kind of
Yes,
like
sure.
become better.
Today's guest is Aditya Agarwal, who was employee number 10 at Facebook and later CTO at Dropbox. Today, he's a partner at South Park Commons, where he has invested in hundreds of companies. With Aditya, we talked about early stage Facebook, moving fast and breaking things, and similarities and differences with Dropbox. We also talked about engineering teams in hypergrowth and the future of engineering management. So let's dive right into the action after a short word from our sponsor. Introducing Sidebar, an exclusive, highly curated leadership program designed to propel you to new professional heights. Picture yourself being a part of a dynamic network of peers, including Fortune 500 leaders and groundbreaking startup CEOs, all offering their unique insights and expertise to fuel your journey. Sidebar is a tech enabled version of the brain trust concept. They provide a supportive and diverse professional circle for in depth advice and honest feedback, leading to substantial career growth. And the results are palpable. A staggering 93% of members affirm that Sidebar has been a game changer in their professional path. Nothing propels your career trajectory like a robust peer group. Learn more at sidebar.com and join thousands of top senior leaders from companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta who have taken the first step towards accelerating their career. Hey, Aditya, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, Luca. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to chat.
Thank you. So, Aditya, you have been one of the early employees at Facebook. You've been CTO at Dropbox. You're now a partner at South Park Commons. You have invested in hundreds of companies. So, I'm
Yeah.
so excited to have you on the show today because you have such a vast and diverse experience working with incredible tech teams. So, I
Okay.
would love to talk about the lessons you have learned in this experience that we can
Sure.
take away. So I
Sure.
would love to start with Facebook because you have been, if I'm not mistaken, employee number 10 there.
Yep. Yep.
And so I'm curious about how did you join and how was Facebook as an early stage tech team?
Yeah. My story in joining Facebook was that I went to university at Carnegie Mellon. I graduated in 2004, and unlike most of the people at CMU, CMU is a fantastic computer science school, but in my graduating class of 150 people, only like four or five of us, I think, moved out to the Bay Area. Everybody
Mm,
else went to Wall Street.
mm,
So, but I decided that listen, I don't want to work for a bank. I don't want to work for a hedge fund. I don't want to work for a quant fund. I want to go and build software that basically is kind of the product. So I moved out to the Bay Area to work for Oracle, and we were basically building kind of like deep in the guts of the database kernel. We were building database kernel software, like pretty low level systems programming. I'd been doing that for maybe 6 months, and it was fun. I was learning a bunch, but I was also just getting a little bored.
mm.
So, I decided to poke my head out of the machine, and I decided to ask around, like, hey, are there interesting, founders or companies? And through one of those, amazing, I would say, serendipitous moments in Silicon Valley, somebody I knew connected me to somebody they knew who connected me to Mark Zuckerberg. I met Mark, and this was a point at which Mark had really decided that he wanted to convert Facebook from a dorm room kind of project into a real
Yeah.
company. And as part of that, he was like, hey, I need to go and hire some software engineers. So there were a few of us who were kind of like the first, I would say, first full time engineers who joined Facebook. Um, I'd say that, I mean, I could tell you so many different things about the Facebook engineering kind of DNA. But maybe one to start off, and I'm sure you can ask more, is that we had an amazing, I would say, culture of first principles thinking at Facebook. One of
Mm-hmm.
the cool things was that a lot of probably our first 20 to 30 engineers, we didn't have a ton of essentially software engineering experience. So
Yeah,
what that meant was that we were able to really take a look at a situation and essentially like figure out like, hey, we think that this is the right way to do things, as opposed to just like pattern matching from the past, right? So one
yeah,
of the big examples I say in the early days is that we didn't actually have any unit tests or regression testing or any kind of like test framework. We would write a bunch of code, and obviously we would test it in our sandboxes to make sure it was working, and then we would push the code live, and then we would see
yeah,
what kind of errors we were getting, and then we would just kind of like hot fix them and fix them, right? And if you think about it, that's kind of an insane system. No software engineering system written by good software engineers would ever advocate for that. But in the early days, our take was that the only thing that is like, not the only thing, the most important thing to making Facebook win is like how quickly can we scale the service and how quickly can we iterate and evolve. And we felt as though like we just needed to optimize for speed everywhere in our development methodology. So that's just
yeah.
like one example of like a extreme example of like how we chose to implement that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great story. And may I take a step back? So you've been hired straight from Oracle, right? So I have to assume
Mhm.
that you didn't have much experience in building the kind of thing that Facebook needed to build, right? So
Absolutely. No,
you,
zero experience.
yeah, so you just like others, maybe I think you were hired for potential, for
Yeah.
personal fit. So
Yeah.
was that how it worked in the early team?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I always tell this story that I find amazing, right? After I left Oracle, joined Facebook. I must have been at Facebook for maybe, gosh, like 2 months. And
Yeah,
then one day, like Zuck walks around to my desk and he's like, "Hey, dude, I'm really gonna have to ask you to write a completely new search engine for Facebook. Search is very important for Facebook because as soon as somebody signs up for Facebook, the first thing that they do is that they search for people that they know, right? They'll be like,
yeah,
oh, I want to
work.
basically send Luca a friend request. So like I'm going to send, a friend to Luca, and it has to always work. It has to have really good ranking. It has to
Yeah.
work for all kinds of variants of people's names and everything. Um, and so when he first told me that, I'm like, Mark, I don't know how to write a search engine. Why don't we just go hire somebody from Google and
Of
Yahoo,
course.
and they know how to do search, and I'll work with them. I'll kind of like work with them to build this. And I remember very clearly, like Mark looked at me and he told me, he's like, yeah, but I didn't know how to build Facebook, but I learned, right? Like I learned. So like if I could learn how to build Facebook, why can't you learn how to like essentially build search? But I was going to say that it was this really important moment for me to kind of internalize the fact that like um, engineering is a broad based kind of like generalist kind of like skill. Like
Yeah.
you go to like you learn about data structures, you learn about algorithms, you learn about how to reason about moving data from one place
Yeah.
to the other. And to this day, like I believe that like what language you use, what operating system, what framework, these are all interchangeable. You want to
Yeah.
use, like Rust, C, C++, like C sharp, like Objective C, Cocoa, Swift, whatever. It's all easy to learn. This is not the
Yeah.
hard part. The tough part is actually like believing that you have the ability to really
Mm.
like learn about like what you're doing.
So I love this story, absolutely. And I think, if anything, fast forward today, maybe, 15 years later, this is even more true. I mean, because I feel that today with AI, with good tooling, everything that we have, it is even easier to get, basic proficiency at any part of the stack, any kind of technology. So maybe it's even more true that, especially early stage, you just surround yourself with brilliant generalists that can learn things fast and you go with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I'd say one thing, which is that, obviously, whether it be at Facebook, at Dropbox, even at the startups today, I really encourage people to hire like generalists,
Mm-mm,
people who, kind of are comfortable essentially learning a bunch of different technologies.
mm-mm,
Um, Maybe a slightly modified version of that. I think it's totally cool if you want to hire people who are domain experts,
mm-hmm.
but I think even if you're a domain expert, right, I think you have to have like a mental, in some ways, flexibility to want to
Yeah,
learn new things, right? I think you really get into trouble when you're like, hey, I know how to like, build these really complicated, essentially like, training, distributed training systems for like machine learning models. But by the way, I'm never going to write any kind of like boilerplate front end code. I'm just like, well, if you're an engineer, it's not that hard to just like, it might
yeah.
not be the best use of your time forever, but if you just need to roll up your sleeves and get something done, just do it.
Yeah, and I think after the problem is that after many years that maybe you have specialized into some domain or some part of the stack,
So,
even in your head you get kind of cornered. You think that your career
yeah.
depends on that, and you get naturally less flexible at learning new things because you're thinking you're kind of giving up what you know, what you're known for. So I think it's harder. You get more easily pigeonholed into something.
I agree. I agree. But I think my one piece of advice to everyone out there, and I try to follow this myself, is that kind of like just make sure you always have a mindset where you're comfortable learning new things, right? Like
Yeah,
our lives, our careers are like this balance to your point of like becoming better and better at one specialty, but then make sure you retain kind of the ability to just learn new things, because I think like the world is changing so rapidly that kind of like having the confidence in the ability to learn new things is super important.
yeah, yeah. Even more than probably knowing the things themselves, because it
100%.
gets
100%.
easier and easier. I feel to learn new things. So the real real hedge that we have, maybe it's just that kind of attitude, that confidence that
Absolutely.
okay, I go for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So and so you mentioned how at the beginning the team was kind of reckless, just pushing things in production, no tests, no whatsoever. So
Yeah.
I was thinking about the real moving fast and breaking things that Facebook
Yeah.
was known for. So this was not a myth, right? So it was real, and
No, no, no. It was a
it's
very
been
real
real for
thing.
years. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think we really took it as a core competitive advantage that we would just be able to move like much much faster than
Yeah.
almost like any of. We didn't really think a ton about competition, but our take was that like we would never be hampered like by speed, right? We
Yeah.
would be the world's fastest moving engineering organization in terms of our ability to fix bugs, to react to feedback, to build new features. And we might make mistakes in the sense that like we were very comfortable kind of like making mistakes as an organization, but what we prided ourselves on was like how quickly could we recover from the mistakes. As an example, um, one of the things that we often did in onboarding is that for a long time at Facebook, you show up on day one, you have a new job as an engineer, you show up on day one, you get your laptop. On day one, immediately, we kind of like make sure you know how to like essentially check out the code base.
Yeah.
You kind of like get super familiar. You get assigned a ticket and you have to submit your first bug fix within 24 hours, and you
Wow.
have to hit kind of the code, like essentially like we had weekly code pushes on Tuesdays, and then obviously we had daily hot fixes. But the weekly code push that was on Tuesday, you had to hit it. And like it was one of those marks of honor that like, hey, I managed to get push code out on my
Yeah.
second day as an engineer at Facebook, because what we really wanted you to like learn is that that's the speed at which the organization moves at, right?
Yeah.
And it was just something that was really important to us. It was kind of like really built into our DNA.
Yeah, I love this story as well. But I feel like that this is something that requires some preparation, right? I mean, as opposed
Oh
to
yeah.
I mean, if you decide not to write tests, you decide that you push the code and it's done. But if you want to make new joiners push code within the first 24 or 48 hours. There are things you have to do, I guess. I mean, you have to have maybe a list of tasks that are suitable for first timers,
So
maintain good
absolutely.
developer tools, and yeah,
Oh yeah, absolutely. We invested a lot in internal tools. We invested a lot in kind of like internal, I would say, like we built our own code review system internally. So we actually had a lot of like Facebook was actually really good at investing in internal tools. In fact, I would say that as I became more senior at Facebook and as I was basically managing bigger and bigger teams, a lot of my time was actually spent in writing internal tools because we had a big culture of that. And you're totally correct that, like, you're not completely, thrown off the deep end on day one. Like, after you came in, like, you would be assigned kind of like a buddy or a mentor. They would really be helping answer any questions. Um, but even so, with all of that, I would say that people's experience on that first day was so different than kind of the experience they had at previous companies. Because for most companies, you go there on day one, you kind of do some like HR kind of onboarding, you talk about benefits, you set up your payroll, you do all
yeah,
of these things, but you don't actually do real work on day. Or you maybe go out for a lunch with your kind of team members. And I think at Facebook, our take was like, yeah, we'll do all of that later in the week. But if an engineer shows up, the first thing we want to do is to get them writing code. We'll help
yeah.
them. We'll have somebody who kind of like is their buddy and mentor. But we really want to start telling them that, like, this is the speed at which the organization moves, right? And I think it was a really, sometimes it almost, I would say, induced a sense of like shock in some new people, especially if they'd been in the industry for a while, because that's just
Yeah,
not how they'd been used to thinking about it. But I would argue that for those people, this kind of onboarding was actually even more important, because we
yeah,
had to get them to like unlearn all of their mental models of like how engineering is supposed to be done, and really get them to understand this is how we do it at Facebook.
yeah. And I guess this pays off, especially in environments where you are in hyper growth. So you're hiring engineers all the time, and otherwise you get swamped with
Absolutely.
training engineers all the time. And I think
Absolutely.
your team gets slower instead of getting faster
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you're hiring.
yeah. I mean, our take was actually that, like, I mean, you have a really good point, right? Because generally, the normally accepted, I would say, wisdom is that, like, hey, as an engineering team grows, then overall your speed on a per engineer basis goes down. Your
Yeah,
aggregate output might be high because obviously you have more people, but on an individual basis you're moving slower. And our take was that, why does that have to be true? Why does like a team of 20 why can't they move faster? Like, what if
yeah,
there's better tooling? What if there's like better, almost like, task like routing? Like, there's no reason why we have to accept that things have to move slower, right? And
yeah,
again,
exactly.
this is aspirational, but I think this is the mindset that you can bring to it, which is that you don't have to accept that things have to get slow, right? Like, you can actually say that, like, hey, maybe things can actually get faster at a
Yeah.
certain team size and so on.
Yeah, that's true. I agree that at some point it's inevitable you get slightly slowed down, but you have to keep that kind of mindset, that aspirational
100%.
goal to still
Absolutely.
operate, yeah, like a smaller company. And how big was the team then when you eventually left Facebook?
Oof, good question. Maybe like 600 engineers, maybe like 700
Wow,
engineers, maybe the whole company was a couple of thousand people. Yeah.
wow.
It was incredible. What an incredible journey in the first, like, 6 7 years of the company.
Incredible, really incredible journey. And then you went on to found a startup, right, that got acquired
Mhm.
by Dropbox. If I did
I
my
did.
homework right. Yeah.
Yes. We started a company called Cove. Um, at Cove, we were basically building modern collaboration software.
Yeah.
Our take was that, within Facebook, as Facebook kind of grew, and you have to remember this was before Slack, before any of these tools. But internally within Facebook, we had almost stopped using email
Hmm.
to essentially collaborate with one another. We were using a lot of like internal, like Facebook Messenger and we had like this other internal tooling that we had built that was really kind of helping to cut down on the amount of email that people had. So our take when we left Facebook was that how do we bring some of those similar modalities around
Yeah.
short form, efficient communication, or communication that was oriented around a certain piece of content? How do we bring that like to everyone? So that's what we were working on at Cove. Um, we'd been working on it for a couple of years, and that's when Drew and Arash, who were the co-founders at Dropbox, who had known for a while, Ruchi and I had known them for a while, they said, hey, why don't we join forces? Because a lot of what Dropbox is used for, in addition to cloud storage and syncing, is also to enable collaboration around pieces of content. So we are like, yeah, actually, a lot of similar alignment in terms of what the company is doing. So why don't we join forces? So we were Dropbox's first acquisition back in 2012 or 13. And then, yeah, so the company was still pretty small at the point, both companies were pretty small at the point of kind of the acquisition. But that, then I'm happy to talk about Dropbox if that's where you want to go.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So you joined straight as the CTO, or you rose through the ranks and then you?
Yeah, I was basically like heading all of engineering at the
Yeah,
point that I joined as a VPE and CTO. So
yeah,
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the company, you have these fancy titles, but ultimately, like you're working with like people, and
yeah.
the engineering team was about 16 people at the point that the acquisition went through. So I started to manage all those engineers. And Dropbox as a whole was only 30 or 40 people. So still pretty small at the
Wow,
point that like, the acquisition happened. Yeah.
wow, wow. And what kind of similarities and differences you found in Dropbox, uh, culture-wise, tech-wise, with respect to Facebook?
It's a fantastic question. I'd say that the big similarities were again like the first principles thinking, right? Like there was
Mm,
a lot of focus on like we don't have to apply traditional wisdom. Like we should figure out like what is the right thing to do for our company, for our product, right? Like
yeah,
the team was again actually a lot of people who were probably lower on the experience end, right? Like these were
yeah,
not people who had multiple decades of experience as software engineers. um, but again, very high first principles, generalist engineers. So we had a lot of engineers who are not afraid to kind of like roll up their sleeves and write backend server code, or write desktop client software, or write essentially like middleware API stuff. So again, a team that was very comfortable kind of like doing a bunch of different things. um, However, there were also some big differences. And I think that the big differences were actually really because of the product that we were building. The big
mm,
one big difference was that I kind of tell people that at Facebook in the early days, uh, we were building a fun social product. If one out of every 100 things you tried to do on Facebook didn't work, you'd be like, I'll just try again.
it's
Like I'll
fine.
send a
Yeah,
friend request again, or like I'll just load the page again, and it's not a big deal. And I tell people that on the other hand, at Dropbox, because of what we were working on, if once out of every 100 times either a request didn't work, or some file got corrupted, or it didn't
yeah,
sync properly, there was a sync error, then the reality is that you would think that your computer was broken. If your hard drive
yeah,
once out of every 100 times didn't work, you would think your computer was broken. So at Dropbox, we actually had this completely different culture, which is we really valued correctness, we really valued safety, we really valued kind of like our process for how we roll new changes out. We were very methodical, very careful in terms of like regression testing, correctness testing. It was a very very different mindset, right?
yeah.
Oh, the other one, um, Dropbox was actually building, it was one of the few companies that was actually building client software, right? Which
Oh,
is that
right.
we actually had
That's
to
true.
ship code to the client. So if there was a huge big bug there, it's not easy to kind of like fix that bug in all of like the client software. So that was another where that Facebook, you have a bug, no worries, we just roll out a new version to the web servers. um, so lots of different reasons why at Dropbox our engineering culture had to be a lot more, I would say, circumspect, a lot
Yeah.
more, a lot more precise, a lot more rigorous, a lot, and a little bit slower than Facebook, because like we were, speed was important, but it was as important to have stuff that was secure, reliable, and always, it just always works.
Yeah, yeah. I love this difference because it shows really how sometimes we tend to think that culture of startups depend on product stages. If you're an early stage startup, this is the one way to behave, while instead it pretty much depends on the product you're building. And
Absolutely. No,
yeah,
I could not agree more with you, Luca. In fact, I actually think that the best companies, sorry, if you want to start a company right today, you want to have a startup, I think it's actually pretty useful to go and learn from, oh, this is how Facebook did it, this is how Google did
yeah,
it, this is how Airbnb did it, this is how what Dropbox did it. And I think, but that's good, but that's level one, I think that startups or companies that truly end up becoming really successful actually take the next level and they figure out, like, okay, I get that these are the options, but what is the actual culture I need to create for the kind of product that I am building, right?
yeah,
Um, and once they figure that out, they're really able to, in some ways, integrate that into their culture, into their hiring, into their promotion processes,
yeah,
because they understand like the DNA that is working for their product, right? Like I often tell people that like Google is probably the world's best like pure play engineering company, right? Like in terms of like actually building deep engineering products that by themselves are like technically really hard. um, it's because like when they solved web search from in 1997, when they solved web search, Google didn't have much of a UI, they didn't have much of a product, but
yeah.
like the technology underneath it in terms of like actually indexing the whole web, serving it much faster than
Insane.
anyone, having better ranking, it was just phenomenal technology, right? And I
Yes.
think that the only kind of culture that is able to do that is a culture that really values like hard engineering, right? They were
Yeah.
like we are going to take a look at these hard distributed systems problems and we are going to solve it. And they did that. They had that culture which they did for search, then they basically solved it for email. Like I am still
Yes.
a Gmail user because I think Gmail is the best email service out there, because it is able to handle massive amounts of data, search is blazing fast, it is always works, super reliable. It's a really hard search problem, so it's a really hard distributed systems problem, right? um yeah.
Yeah, I love the advice about funding your own culture. I think it all comes down from what you said before, that similarity between Facebook and Dropbox, or thinking from first principles, right? The
Yeah,
best
absolutely.
founders I've known as well. I mean, they listen to everybody. You know that you get to understand how Facebook operates, how Dropbox operates, but then you think
Yeah,
from first principles and figure out what works best for you, and best for your product, best for you as a founder group. Maybe you
yeah,
have traits that are more in one way or another, and you find your own recipe, I believe.
100%.
And one similarity, I think, in the two situations was hyper growth, right? Because then even
Yep,
Dropbox got to incredible growing
yep,
size. So they say that hyper growth makes or breaks companies, lots of
yep.
issues or and opportunities as well. So how was it for you? What were the challenges, and how did you get through them?
Yeah, oh wow, so many. I think with hyper growth, the big almost mental model um, shift you have to make is that it's okay, is that you have to stop feeling bad about stuff that is broken, in my
Yeah,
opinion, right? Because in most companies, and actually in most professions or companies, the whole point is that you hire somebody, you create a team, and that team is supposed to come up with systems and processes that really like get better over time, right?
Yeah.
Like you're supposed to become better at kind of the job that you're given, the task that is given, and the task often doesn't change that much in a short time frame. So you have some time to kind of become in some ways competent, and you develop expertise on it, right?
Yeah.
In hypergrowth, what happens is that if you are doing your job correctly, often every 2 to 3 months, you will find that the problem statement is changing rapidly. So, now what this means is that a team that was feeling like they were doing a good job will actually now start to feel like they're not doing a great job. This also applies to individuals, right? They were like, oh, I was so good at my job of like manage like doing this thing, and now suddenly like I don't actually feel that I'm doing a great job. So the biggest challenge in hypergrowth is that how do you get your organization to almost internalize that things will be changing very rapidly. Like the only constant will actually kind of be
Change.
change in the problem statement, change in the scope of your role. And you should not feel like bad when those change moments come about, because in some ways like that is kind of the price of success, that like your previous system, your previous definition of what you were trying to do no longer is as important because suddenly the pie grows, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I find that the people who really frankly tend to get left behind during hypergrowth is the people who are holding on too tightly to what they think the company should do or what the job is. And like in some ways, the company grows too rapidly and they're kind of left with a mental model of the company as it was 6 months ago.
Yeah. Comes back to the idea of being willing to learn and
Yes,
do different things.
100%. Exactly. In fact, like I think that, one thing that's interesting is that I think in Silicon Valley, we kind of like we obviously admire people who have gone through hyper growth, right? Like everybody kind of like in some ways is like, oh, cool, you were there in the hyper growth years. But I've now come to understand that some people might be just more comfortable learning new things
Mm.
than like other people. Like some people actually want to develop long-term mastery and expertise in a smaller domain, and they're not quite as like, hey, I'm going to learn something completely new every 3 to 6 months, right?
Yeah.
And I think that both of these profiles are incredibly valuable for companies and organizations. So one thing that I often tell people is that, like try to think hard about like, do you want to be in a place where every 3 months you feel very incompetent, right? And not everybody is emotionally cut out to actually be in a place like that, because it can get really tiring, right? Like you kind of go through like, oh, I'm so good at this, to being like, oh, I'm actually don't know what I'm doing anymore, right? And that's actually a very disorienting feeling, that I tell people that if you're joining a hypergrowth company, you have to be very comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's a great take. And how do you feel about hypergrowth today? That is, I'm thinking that we have had this original, let's say, cohort of companies that went through
Yeah.
hypergrowth, like the Facebook, the Dropbox, the
Yeah.
Uber, and the big tech, what we call today big tech. But today there is also this perception that big tech is kind of bloated in some cases, right? You
Sure.
hear many, we have layoffs, we have Elon's story with X,
Yeah.
and you also hear stories of companies doing extremely well with very few engineers, right? So,
Yeah.
do you think that we will ever see again hyper growth headcount wise, let's say, as we saw in the past decade, or are we heading towards smaller engineering teams, a different kind of model for very successful companies? I mean, always worldwide successful tech companies.
That's a really good question, Luca. Actually, that's a really good question. I think you are probably correct that the next hyper growth story will probably look different than the ones we have seen before. But I would argue, Luca, that this has already been playing out, I think, over the last 30 or 40 years. Where if you look at kind of like how big Microsoft is
Yeah.
versus like how big Google is versus how big Facebook is, and then maybe like even like let's say Airbnb, how big Airbnb
Yeah.
is. These engineering teams, Microsoft maybe has like 100,000 plus engineers. Google probably has like 50, 60,000. Facebook has 20,000. I'm guessing Airbnb only has 3 or 4 thousand engineers, right? So I think that every generation of these companies actually become more efficient and smaller. And I think you're totally correct that if you extrapolate out, I think that the next crazy big like generational company will feel even a lot smaller than what we think of like as an Airbnb or a Facebook. Absolutely. And I think that, you know, AI is making engineers a lot more efficient. I think we're also learning how to do more with like less people.
Yeah.
Um, and I also think that companies are nowadays like in a world where you have, for instance, one of the reasons why Facebook is a lot larger than Airbnb is because they run their own infrastructure. Like
Yeah.
so they actually have to have like a massive like operations team that basically does that, all the way from like bare metal all the way up. Airbnb is using everything in the cloud. That makes a huge difference, right? So I do think that every successive generation you need to you can choose to focus on what is the most important thing for your company, and basically like let other companies provide kind of like software as a service or kind of like hardware as a service that you can essentially utilize without having to bring that in house.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think I mean, I've read many stories recently, like Telegram that has only 30 engineers and the CEO is the only
Exactly.
PM, or
Yeah.
Perplexity has 50 engineers. I mean, and they are not planning to grow that much. I mean,
Yep.
it feels definitely true. And do you think that this increased efficiency applies equally to strictly coding or to management? Are we getting even leaner when it comes to engineering management, which got because I'm thinking at layoffs and middle management and engineering managers
Yeah.
were very much affected, and there is now this perception that the idea of management that has come out of Silicon Valley for a lot of time is kind of overblown. Uh, what do you think?
Yeah. I agree with that. I actually think that like I think that the Silicon Valley management structure is a little bit too bloated.
Mm,
I do not actually think we need as many middle managers in kind of like engineering as we have today. So I do think that like we will. I do think that organizations should be flatter. I think there
mhm.
should be fewer levels of like essentially like indirection. I think that I think people should embrace a lot of these tools that allow people to like communicate, to collaborate, to coordinate. But I think more fundamentally, I just think that like we just don't need as many managers. And I say this as having been a manager in the past, but I fundamentally believe that we can actually get by with a lot more of a flatter, leaner org structure. And I
Yeah.
suspect that those organizations will actually be nimbler, but also just like a little bit happier. Like I think
Hmm.
that like the less management you have around and the more people that can focus on actually creating, I think the overall the better it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And we have actually run a survey. I mean, kind of a big thread on the private community of refactoring, asking engineering managers how they felt about their contribution, if it was becoming more technical, it was changing. And one big takeaway is that it feels like engineering managers are becoming more technical. I mean, more hands-on
Yeah.
that they used to be. So there is this trend where if you're a manager, you're expected to have a stronger technical contribution than, for example, 10 years ago. I mean, are you seeing this as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we went through a phase where a lot of engineering managers thought of themselves as like people managers,
Yeah.
right? Like their take was like, hey, I'll focus on hiring. I'll focus on giving people feedback. I'll focus on like mentorship, coaching, career advice. But hey, I'm not actually going to have a very strong point of view in terms of like the actual technical decisions or the architecture decisions. um, and I think that's, and frankly, like I probably did a bunch of that because I was like, oh, that's how managers should be, which is that we should not be actually like, we should let the engineers make the decisions,
Yeah.
right? We should let kind of like the people who are writing the code make the decisions. But now more and more I'm seeing that like, no, I think ultimately and engineering with engineering managers should actually be responsible for making sure that like their team makes awesome technical decisions. Like that is your
Yeah.
responsibility and you have to own it. And sometimes part of like that owning it as the manager is that you have to go and make sure that the right decision is made. So you need to be able to go and determine like, hey, is this you need to have judgment, like is this a
Yeah.
good solution or not? Is this actually the right decision? You cannot say like, oh, I out like, hey, I didn't make that decision, my tech lead made that decision. That's not good enough, right? Like you have
Yeah.
to own kind of like the technical decision at the end of the day, which means that sometimes you might have to like actually make the decision.
Yeah.
And I think this is actually all really good. I think part of, by the way, having the technical intuition to be able to make these decisions is that I think every engineering manager should probably spend 20-30% of their time writing code. Like pick a project, but spend a day a week writing some code. At least make sure you know like how is the, like if your team is creating something, then I think it's important that you know like what they are creating, how they are creating it. And I think you should, every engineering leader should be spending probably a day a week like actually producing code.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I saw that there is an article that you have written, I think, a couple of years ago, but you reposted it recently about that says that your CTO should actually be
Yeah,
technical, right? This should not
that's
be
right.
controversial, of course. It
Yeah,
made me think that yesterday we had a community event, like a group coaching session, and there was a CTO, and he said that he wasn't sure about his technical contribution, right? The company was growing, he was hiring better and better engineers, and of course, his
yeah,
skills cannot be a superset of all the technical skills
yeah, sure.
of his team. So, how does an engineering manager or a CTO, an engineering leader in general, stay technical, and how should they think about their technical contribution? For example, as a CTO, I mean, you have been a CTO of a very, very technical problem
Yep.
and company. So how was it for you even?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of different strategies that you can use, right? Like one strategy is that you can pick a small project. You can pick a project that hopefully is not on the critical path, because I think if you're an engineering leader, you you get pulled into a bunch of different things.
Yeah,
You might not, sometimes you might have like, you might not be able to write code for like 2 weeks or something. So maybe pick a project that's not on the critical path, but then own it. Like use all of the development workflows, kind of like understand like how people on your team are kind of using essentially their software development lifecycle workflows. Like actually live and breathe kind of like being an engineer, but for a project that's not on the critical path. Number
yeah,
one. Number two, you could build internal tools. I know a lot of engineering leaders who like to build internal tools because it allows them to continue writing code, but then also kind of like hopefully like, provide value for their team. Number three, you could always like, honestly, like there's so many different ways to like learn about new technologies. Like one thing that I did 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago, was that Andre Karpathy has this incredible series on like building nano GPT. Like you can
yeah,
literally actually build GPT-2 from scratch by following along. Do that, right? Like you will definitely understand how back propagation works. You'll definitely understand like all of the tweaks, all of the parameters you need to tweak, kind of like to build a foundation model. And it's like it's a beautiful way to learn, right? So I think that you are correct that it's not, it's really interesting. I think that as an industry we don't actually tell people that how to remain technical
yeah,
as kind of an engineering organization grows. But I think that like you don't, it's not obvious, but there are all these small ways. Just pick one of them and just like start kind of like feeling like as though you understand what's happening technically. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah, and I love the idea of building internal tools because I think, especially as a CTO, as a high level manager, I mean, it keeps you even connected with the developer experience of people in your
Absolutely.
team, right? I mean, how they work. So, in a way, it's your duty to make sure that
Yeah,
that stays great. And what better way if not building the tools themselves?
absolutely.
Yeah. So I wanted to keep the final part of the interview to give you the chance to talk about the work that you're doing at South Park Commons,
Sure.
which I love, by the way. So what does SPC do, and why does it matter? So
Yeah.
I read about it. It's really exciting. So just tell us about it.
Cool. Yeah, we started South Park Commons with kind of like the North Star that we wanted to allow people to take some time to figure out like problems worth working on. Like
Yeah,
our observation was that in Silicon Valley, you leave a big tech job or you kind of sell your company, and immediately like all of kind of the forces push you into your
yeah,
next thing. Oh, go join my friend's startup. Oh, let me give you some money so you can start your own company. Or hey, this great startup that you should talk to. And our take was that, well, why don't you actually just take 6 months and actually like be creative, like explore, tinker, write some code, maybe throw away your first idea, throw away your second idea, right?
yeah,
Instead of like actually like almost in some ways getting plugged into the mainframe, like actually like unplug so you can let your mind like actually explore a little bit more creatively what might be interesting problems to work on, right?
yeah,
So we started South Park Commons with this core observation, which is that like we want to allow engineers and technologists to basically tinker, to explore, and to find big ideas, amazing ideas to work on. And kind of the component of the fund for it is that as people come up with these ideas, they apply for funding, kind of like to our fund, and we kind of like essentially give them capital to kind of go work on their ideas.
yeah. I love this story and the approach because that resonates very much with me because I've been a startup founder for many years, and then I
Yeah.
happened to have this moment of hiatus because of the COVID phase. We worked in the travel
Mhm.
space, so it's like everything came to a halt, and we
Yeah.
eventually sold the companies. But I stayed like 3 months with less duties, let's say more time to think. And during those months, eventually I came up with the idea of starting to write the newsletter, which I'm now full time on. But I
Yeah.
would have never, you know, being able to put the pieces together of why that was the right thing to start at that moment if I not had that time to think, you know.
Yeah.
And this is something that I continue to think about because it's not like I decided I wanted to take some time. It happened by chance, so as many things in life.
Yeah.
But whenever I think about great stories of people who went on to do different things in their lives with respect to previous things, it's always after some time that they were able to
Yeah.
take a step
100%.
back
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
reflect.
Absolutely. I think that and it's also really interesting. I would say the other aspect of South Park Commons is that when people go on to great things, they're often surrounded by other people who are kind of like very talented, who are all kind of like in this awesome, like slightly competitive, slightly collaborative setting. You know, like if you think about academia, you think about sports teams, there are these really talented people who are all kind of pushing each other to kind of
Yeah,
like
sure.
become better. And this is kind of the environment that we have at SPC, which is we have 100 engineers here in SF, about 100 engineers in New York, all of whom are tinkering, and they're all kind of like challenging each other to kind of like build something even more interesting, even better, while also, yeah, they're kind of like pushing each other, and we are a strong, I would say, proponent of that philosophy.
Yeah, I love this. And I think, of course, this is even more true for founders probably, but it's even true for regular employees, engineers, and people
Absolutely.
who are thinking about a change. Of course, you have to be able, to afford to stay some time without working and thinking about. So I totally understand that. But if you're able to take a step back sometimes, otherwise we go for the, the local optimum. We
100%.
jump between
Yeah.
things and we miss the big picture sometimes. Not always,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Sometimes.
agree.
Absolutely.
So Aditya, thank you so much for this chat. I loved it, and thank you again for being on the show today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the questions, and I look forward to seeing it when it comes out.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.